Hi everybody, it is mixing paint day. Yay, what fun. So I wanted to go ahead and share how I mix my paints, the consistency to look for, and then at the end we'll also do a drip test so that you can check to make sure that all of your consistencies are the same. That is one really important part of a Dutch pour, whether you're spinning it or just doing a regular Dutch pour, is making sure that all of your paint consistencies are the same. That includes the base coat as well as the colors that will go on top of it. I am using Amsterdam titanium white, and my ingredients are very simple. It's just two. I have water and I have paint. I don't put anything else in it. And how I start is I'll put 1 part water in 1 cup and then 1 part paint in another cup. Now the ratio for the final mix will probably be somewhere around 45% water to 55% paint. That is approximate. So the reason that this is an approximate is because every paint has a little different density and will require a little bit more or a little bit less water. So some colors might need just 40% water, some might need up to 50%. It really just depends. There are 2 checks that you can do, which I'll be able to show you towards the end of this video, that will help you gauge if your consistency is right, if it's thin enough. This is a very thin consistency. Also, I am using Amsterdam titanium white. This is a very highly pigmented paint. It can support this much water, can actually support more water. But I typically don't need to go over that 50% mark ever. There are not a lot of paints out there that can support this much water. Liquitex is another one that performs really, really well. I just prefer Amsterdam. It seems a little creamier, not that that matters. But in any case, the reason I start with 1 part water to 1 part paint is because this water line is my cue to stop. I typically don't need to go over, but it can be very easy to accidentally put just a little bit too much water in, and then you might end up with a really runny and too thin of a consistency. So once again, this is just my little safety check that I should not go over that amount, and when I start getting closer, to start really slowing it down. So we're gonna go ahead and get started here. I start with just pouring a little bit of water into my paint. You don't want to go fast with this. You don't want to, throw the whole thing of water in there and then just start mixing away. The reason is because if you do that, you're going to have a much higher probability of not all of the paint mixing properly, and that will probably leave you with some clumps in your paint. I don't know if you've ever had a painting dry and you see a little clump protruding from it. They're very unsightly. So it's just better to have clump-free paint. So take your time with it, mix in just a very little bit of water at a time, and be sure to scrape the sides really, really well, because the thicker paint will stick to the sides and also the bottom. Scrape that bottom. You want to make sure that every single drop of paint in here is mixed the exact same and ends with the exact same consistency. Also, that thicker paint doesn't just stick to the sides and the bottom, it also will stick to your stir stick. So I also scrape that off. So give that a really good healthy mix until it becomes nice and creamy looking, and then we will go ahead and add just a little bit more water. Stirring it until it's nice and creamy, and then go ahead and repeat that process just a little at a time. Okay guys, we're back. I'm about to show you the 2 checks that I look for when gauging consistency. And real quick, I do want to just add something. Earlier when I mentioned that the amount of water you put in is not exact, simply because, all paints have a little different density. That doesn't actually just apply to the colors. For example, this titanium white that I use, every single bottle is a little bit different. I buy the exact same color, the exact same brand from the exact same store, and every bottle is just a little bit different. Sometimes it's a little bit thicker and I might need closer to 50% water. Sometimes it's a little bit thinner and I don't quite need as much. And that's why it's so important to gauge the consistency by these checks, just to make sure you don't end up with something that's too thick or too thin. So I have mixed up already about half of the water that was in this cup. And let me just show you what this looks like right now. It's obviously still way too thick. I'm gonna put a healthy dose of paint onto this stir stick, and then I'm gonna drip it about 1/2 inch above the paint. That's check number 1. So you see how that's forming a pretty thick mound, a mound on top of a mound? That is too thick. You want it to be an extremely slight mound and then immediately melt into the paint. So this is way too thick. The second check that I do is what I call a little drizzle test. You take the paint and then you just lightly drizzle it on top. And you can see that it's leaving a trace. You don't want it to leave any trace. When you lightly drizzle it, you want it to immediately melt right into that paint. So that is check number 2. And both of them are equally important because this one might actually work out, but if you're still seeing a trace, then you need to add just a little bit more water. So I'm gonna add just a little bit of water here. I'll mix again, and then I will come back a little bit further down the road. All right, we are back once again, and I'm gonna go ahead and show you what this looks like. So when I drip this off of the stick, see how that forms just a very slight mound and then immediately melts? Now, it still is a little bit too thick, but if you're just looking at this one thing, it might look like, okay, that's pretty close to done. But let's go ahead and do that drizzle test. And you can see, I don't know how well the camera's picking this up, but it's still leaving a trace on top of the paint. I think you can see it better if I twirl it around. So it's still sitting on top of that paint before it melts in when I do this little drizzle test. So that means that it's not quite done. We need a little bit more water in, but I am gonna slow it down a little bit because this is a point where if you accidentally put just a little bit too much water in, you might end up with something that's a little too thin. So we'll put just a little bit at a time. And we'll stir again. I'll go ahead and fast forward past a lot of this just so that you don't have to watch me mix. So, okay, we are done here. I have used about, let me put this in front of the actual camera. So I've used about 95% of the water that was in this cup. So this mix is now approximately 45% water to 55% paint. I'll go ahead and take you in to show you what the drip test looks like. So to drip it from the stick, very slight mound and then immediately melts in to the paint. Let me actually show you with a different stick. Just because this is a larger one, more paint sits on top of it. All right, this is actually a better one. It's not quite as thick and not quite as much paint sits on it. So you see that very, very ever so slight mound and then immediately melts in. Now let's go ahead and do the drizzle test just to be sure. And there is no trace. It immediately just melts in. So we are good to go. This mix is ready.